I pushed through the glass doors of Titan Maritime's Houston headquarters, the morning heat already oppressive even in the climate-controlled lobby. The corporate aesthetic hit me immediately. Polished marble floors, oversized oil platform photographs, and that particular smell of expensive coffee mixed with recycled air conditioning. 3 years since I'd been inside one of these places, and nothing had changed except maybe the artwork had gotten more expensive. The receptionist directed me to the 14th floor, where a nervous-looking man in his late 30s waited by the elevator bank. His suit looked like it cost more than my truck, but he wore it like someone who'd rather be in jeans. "Mr. Long, Christopher Wilson, Risk Management." His handshake was damp and he kept glancing at his watch. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." We rode the elevator in silence, Wilson's pen clicking in a steady rhythm that made my jaw clench. The conference room overlooked the Houston skyline, but Wilson immediately drew the blinds and spread a collection of satellite images across the mahogany table. "The Deepwater Perseus went dark 4 days ago," he said, pulling out a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. 12 crew members, no distress signals, no equipment failures logged in their automated systems. I picked up the clearest satellite photo. The oil rig sat perfectly centered in the frame, looking exactly like every other deep-water platform I'd worked on over the past 15 years. No visible damage, no debris field, no obvious signs of catastrophe. "Environmental conditions?" I asked, though I already knew what he'd say. "Clear skies, calm seas. Weather monitoring shows nothing unusual in the 72 hours before contact was lost." Wilson's pen clicked faster. "The rig's automated systems are still transmitting. Generators running, safety lights functional, even the coffee makers are on their regular schedule." I studied the images more carefully. Something about the platform's positioning looked off, though I couldn't pinpoint what exactly. The angle of the drilling tower, maybe, or the way the support vessels were arranged around it. "Any family members hear from crew before they disappeared?" "That's the strange part." Wilson opened another folder, revealing what looked like phone records. Final contact was a routine check-in with the platform manager's wife at 14:30 hours. Everything normal, talked about weekend plans, complained about the food. 3 hours later, nothing. Define nothing. Radio silence, but not equipment failure. The communications array responds to pings, accepts incoming calls, just nobody answers. He paused, clicking his pen 3 more times. "Mr. Long, Titan is facing some serious liability issues here. Families are asking questions, maritime insurance is breathing down our necks, and the media hasn't gotten hold of this yet." I'd worked enough corporate gigs to recognize the subtext. They didn't want answers as much as they wanted someone to blame when things went sideways. Still, 12 people don't just vanish from a floating city without leaving traces. "I'll need my usual team," I said. "Non-negotiable." "Already arranged. Your office sent over the roster yesterday." Wilson handed me another folder. "They should be arriving within the hour." The team files felt reassuringly familiar. Nancy Marino, marine biologist with 3 degrees and enough deep-sea experience to make seasoned oil workers nervous. Guy Thomas, engineer who knew every bolt and rivet on platforms like the Perseus. Barbara Mason, medic who'd kept more divers alive than anyone had a right to expect. Wayne Jadestone, equipment coordinator who could jury-rig anything that floated, flew, or dove. "Transportation?" I asked. "The Meridian is already prepped and waiting at the harbor. Fully equipped research vessel should handle everything you need for search and recovery operations." Wilson's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and I caught a flicker of something that looked like fear cross his face before he composed himself. "Is there something else I should know about this rig?" I asked. "Such as?" "You're sweating through a $1,000 suit in an air-conditioned room, and you've been checking that phone like you're expecting bad news. Either you're worried about more than maritime insurance, or you've got information you're not sharing." Wilson set down his pen, finally breaking the clicking rhythm. "Mr. Long, Titan Maritime operates 47 deep-water platforms across the Gulf of Mexico. We've had equipment failures, weather incidents, even a few accidents over the years. But 12 experienced crew members don't just disappear without explanation. Meaning we need answers, and we need them before this situation gets out of hand. An hour later, I was standing on Pier 19 watching my team load gear onto the Meridian. The research vessel looked solid enough, 90 feet of reinforced hull designed for extended ocean operations. Not the newest boat I'd worked from, but definitely not the oldest. Nancy arrived first, hauling what looked like half a marine biology lab in waterproof containers. I'd worked with her twice before, and she had a reputation for being thorough to the point of obsession. Today, though, she seemed different. More focused, maybe, or just better prepared than usual. "Interesting assignment," she said, wiping sweat from her forehead as she supervised the loading of her equipment. "I've never worked a rig that size before. First time for everything." She nodded, but something in her expression suggested she wasn't being entirely honest. The way she glanced at the Titan Maritime folder in my hand, like she'd seen it before. Guy Thomas showed up 20 minutes late, apologizing profusely while checking his phone every 30 seconds. The guy looked like he hadn't slept in days, and his hands shook slightly when he signed the equipment manifest. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Yeah, just some personal stuff. Nothing that'll interfere with the job." He glanced at his phone again. "How long do you think we'll be out there?" "Depends what we find. Could be a few days, could be a week." Guy nodded, but I caught him doing quick calculations in his head. Money problems, most likely. Guys with gambling debts had a particular way of counting days, like they were counting down to something unpleasant. Barbara Mason arrived in a taxi, looking like she'd packed for a month-long expedition instead of a recovery operation. Her medical bag alone was twice the size of what most medics carried, and she kept double-checking her supplies against a handwritten list. "Expecting trouble?" I asked, watching her arrange trauma kits with military precision. "Better prepared than sorry." She looked up from her inventory, dark eyes serious. "How much do we know about what happened out there?" "Not much. That's why we're going." She nodded, but didn't look convinced. Something about the way she handled her equipment suggested she was preparing for more than routine medical support. Wayne Jadestone was the last to arrive, driving a truck loaded with diving gear and electronic equipment. He'd worked with me on enough jobs that we'd developed an efficient routine. He handled the technical side, I handled the people side, and somehow things got done. Today, though, Wayne seemed distracted. He kept staring at the satellite photos Wilson had given me, his face pale and drawn. "You recognize something?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "Just something feels wrong about this one." "Wrong how?" "Can't put my finger on it. But my grandmother used to tell stories about places in the ocean where things go missing. Said some waters were meant to be left alone." Coming from anyone else, I would have dismissed it as superstition, but Wayne had an uncanny ability to sense problems before they became obvious, and I'd learned to trust his instincts. As we finished loading the last of the equipment, Wilson appeared on the pier, looking even more nervous than he had in the conference room. He handed me a sealed envelope along with a satellite phone. "Emergency contact information," he explained. "Daily check-ins are mandatory. If we don't hear from you every 24 hours, we'll assume something's gone wrong." How reassuring. "Mr. Long, I want to be clear about something. This mission is classified as a search and recovery operation, but..." He paused, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "If you find evidence of criminal activity, corporate sabotage, anything that suggests deliberate action, you contact me immediately. Don't investigate on your own." "What kind of criminal activity are you expecting on an oil platform in the middle of the Gulf?" "Hopefully none. But Titan has enemies, and we can't afford to have the situation escalate beyond what it already is." Wilson left without shaking hands, and I watched his rental car disappear into Houston traffic. Whatever was happening on the Deepwater Perseus, Titan Maritime was scared enough to hire outside contractors and issue warnings about corporate sabotage. The Meridian's engines rumbled to life, and I took one last look at the Houston skyline before heading inside. My team was already settling into their stations, Nancy organizing her lab equipment, Guy reviewing the Perseus technical specifications, Barbara checking medical supplies, Wayne running diagnostics on our diving gear. 4 hours to reach the coordinates Wilson had given us. 4 hours to figure out what had happened to 12 experienced oil workers who'd simply vanished without explanation. As we cleared the harbor and headed into open water, I felt that familiar tightness in my chest that always preceded difficult jobs. 15 years of marine salvage work had taught me to recognize when something was fundamentally wrong with a situation, and everything about this mission felt wrong. The satellite photos showed a perfectly functional oil platform. The technical reports indicated no equipment failures or safety violations. The weather data revealed calm seas and clear skies. But 12 people don't just disappear from a floating city without leaving traces. Someone had to know what happened out there, and I intended to find out who. The Perseus looked wrong even from a distance, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what bothered me about it. Maybe it was how normal everything appeared. Work lights cutting through the overcast evening, the steady hum of generators carrying across the water, even the radar dish rotating in its regular sweep. Oil rigs were supposed to be loud, chaotic places full of constant activity. This one sat quiet as a church on the surface, despite every system running perfectly. "Take us around the port side," I called to the Meridian's pilot. "I want to see the whole platform before we board." The rig rose nearly 200 feet above the waterline, its massive support columns disappearing into the dark Gulf waters below. No visible damage to the superstructure, no debris floating nearby, no signs of fire or explosion. If I hadn't known better, I would have assumed the crew was simply working below deck. Nancy stood at the bow rail, studying the platform through binoculars. She'd been quiet during the 4-hour transit, occasionally making notes in a waterproof journal, but mostly just watching the horizon. Now she seemed more focused, like she was looking for something specific rather than just observing. "Anything unusual?" I asked, moving beside her. "Hard to say without getting closer." She lowered the binoculars but kept her hands on them. The positioning looks standard for this type of platform. No obvious structural problems. Guy emerged from below deck, where he'd spent most of the trip reviewing technical specifications for the Perseus. His phone had finally stopped getting signal about an hour out, which seemed to help his nerves somewhat. "What do you think?" I asked him. "Architecturally, she's solid. Built in 2018, designed for deep-water operations up to 3,000 feet. He pointed toward the drilling tower. "That's a state-of-the-art setup. Cost Titan probably $200 million to construct. So not something they'd abandon lightly."
Definitely not. Barbara joined us on deck, her medical bag slung over one shoulder and what looked like a portable examination kit in her other hand. She'd been organizing her supplies during the trip, checking and rechecking her inventory with the kind of thoroughness that suggested she expected to use everything. "Any theories about what happened to the crew?" she asked. "Too early to speculate," I said, though several possibilities had been running through my head since we left Houston. Accident, equipment failure, medical emergency, even mutiny. All of them seemed unlikely given what Wilson had told us about the rig's continued operation. Wayne appeared from the engine room, wiping his hands on a towel. He'd been running diagnostics on our diving equipment, making sure everything was ready for underwater operations. Now he stood at the rail, studying the Perseus with an expression I couldn't read. "Something wrong?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. It feels empty, like nobody's been there for months instead of days." The pilot maneuvered us toward the platform's main boarding area, where a hydraulic crane usually lifted personnel and supplies from supply boats. The crane arm hung motionless, but the platform's systems had automatically lowered a boarding ladder when our approach triggered the proximity sensors. "At least the automated systems are working," Guy muttered. We tied off to the platform and climbed the ladder one by one, our equipment bags making the ascent awkward but manageable. The main deck felt solid under our feet, but the silence was unsettling. Even with the generators running and equipment humming, something was missing. the background noise of human activity that should have filled every corner of a working oil platform. The main platform entrance led directly into a central corridor lined with administrative offices and common areas. Emergency lighting illuminated the hallway, casting everything in a pale, institutional glow. Our footsteps echoed off the metal walls, the sound seeming to travel further than it should have. Guy checked the first office we passed. "Looks normal?" he called out. "Paperwork on the desk, computer still running?" Barbara examined the bulletin board outside the medical bay. "Duty rosters are current. Last update was 3 days ago." She paused, reading something more carefully. "No reported injuries or illnesses in the past week." We made our way to the control room, the nerve center of the platform's operations. Banks of monitors displayed readouts from dozens of systems: drilling depth, pressure readings, environmental sensors, safety protocols. Everything showed green status indicators, as if the Perseus was operating at peak efficiency with a full crew. Nancy immediately moved to the computer terminals, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she accessed different systems. "Navigation logs, equipment status, production records," she said, reading from the screens. "Everything looks routine through 3 days ago, then just nothing. No entries, no changes, no maintenance reports." Guy found the captain's logbook sitting open on the main console. He flipped through the pages, reading entries from the past week, routine reports about weather conditions, equipment maintenance, personnel rotations. Then he stopped, his face pale. "What is it?" I asked. He turned the logbook toward me. The final entry, dated 3 days ago at 17:30 hours, contained only 4 words written in shaky handwriting. "It came from the abyss." "That's it?" Barbara asked, looking over my shoulder. No explanation, no details. Just that. Guy flipped through the remaining pages, but they were blank. Wayne had moved to the communications console, checking the radio equipment and satellite uplinks. "Everything's functional," he said. "But look at this." He pointed to the emergency beacon controls. "Someone tried to activate the distress signal. The switch is in the ON position, but the system shows it never transmitted." "The equipment malfunction?" I suggested. "Maybe. Or maybe something was jamming the signal." Nancy had moved to a different terminal, accessing what looked like security footage. "I found the surveillance system," she announced. "Internal cameras cover most of the platform, and there are underwater cameras monitoring the drilling operations." We gathered around her screen as she pulled up recordings from 3 days ago. The internal cameras showed normal activity throughout the day. Crew members moving through corridors, working in the control room, eating meals in the galley. Then, sometime around 1700 hours, all the internal footage stopped. "Power failure?" Guy asked. "No, the timestamps continue. The cameras just stop recording people." Nancy switched to external cameras. "But these kept running." The underwater cameras mounted on the rig's support columns showed murky Gulf water illuminated by powerful lights. Fish moved through the frame occasionally, and sediment drifted past in the current. Nancy fast-forwarded through hours of footage, looking for anything unusual. "There," Wayne said suddenly. "Go back about 10 minutes." Nancy reversed the footage, then played it forward at normal speed. At first, I saw nothing but the usual underwater environment. Then something moved at the edge of the frame. A dark shape too large and too fast to be debris or marine life. "What was that?" Barbara asked. Nancy replayed the segment, slowing it down. The shape appeared again, this time more clearly visible as something massive moving beneath the rig. The cameras couldn't capture enough detail to identify what it was, but the scale was enormous, easily the size of a city bus, possibly larger. "Could be a whale," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Whales don't move like that," Wayne replied. "Too fast, too purposeful." Guy was studying readouts from the drilling equipment. According to this, they were operating at maximum depth when the crew disappeared. 3,000 feet down, which is unusual for this location. "Why unusual?"
I asked. The Perseus is designed for deep water drilling, but this area typically doesn't require anything close to maximum depth. Most of the productive formations are much shallower. Nancy had been taking pictures of the computer screens with a small digital camera, documenting the various system readouts and log entries. Something about her thoroughness bothered me. She was photographing technical specifications and equipment details that seemed irrelevant to our investigation. "What exactly are you documenting?" I asked. "Research data," she said without looking up from the camera. "I want to make sure we have complete records of everything we find."
"Including drilling specifications and navigation data. Everything could be relevant. We don't know what caused the crew to disappear." Wayne had wandered off to examine the diving equipment lockers. When he called out, his voice carried a note of confusion. "You guys need to see this." We found him standing in front of an open equipment locker, staring at rows of diving gear arranged in perfect order. Wetsuits hung neatly from hooks, air tanks were properly secured, and diving computers showed full battery charges. "None of it's been used," he said. "Emergency diving equipment, escape pods, life rafts. Everything's exactly where it should be. If the crew had time to prepare for evacuation, they would have taken something." Barbara had moved to the medical bay, a compact but well-equipped facility designed to handle everything from minor injuries to major emergencies. When we joined her, she was studying charts and medical records with a puzzled expression. "No recent treatments," she reported. "No medications dispensed, no injury reports, no sick leave requests. According to these records, the entire crew was in perfect health." The galley told perhaps the most disturbing story. 12 place settings arranged around a large table, each with a full plate of food that had long since spoiled. The meal looked like it had been served but never eaten, as if everyone had simply walked away mid-preparation. "They were about to eat dinner," Barbara observed, studying the plates. "Chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. Looks like someone put a lot of effort into this meal." Nancy photographed the galley from multiple angles, paying particular attention to the kitchen equipment and food storage areas. When I asked why she needed pictures of the industrial refrigerators, she claimed she was documenting the crew's final activities. As we completed our initial survey of the platform, the feeling of wrongness only intensified. Everything suggested normal operations right up until the moment 12 people simultaneously vanished without taking emergency equipment, sending distress signals, or leaving any indication of what had happened to them. The sun had set completely by the time we finished our walkthrough, leaving the platform's work lights as our only illumination. The Perseus felt like a floating ghost town, perfectly preserved, but utterly lifeless. We should set up for the night, I decided. Get some rest, then start diving operations in the morning. "Where do you want to sleep?" Guy asked. "The crew quarters are available, but it feels wrong to use dead men's beds," Wayne finished. We ended up arranging sleeping bags in the main conference room, keeping our gear close and maintaining watch schedules. As the others settled in for the night, I found myself standing at the observation deck, looking out at the dark Gulf waters. Somewhere beneath us, 3,000 feet down in the abyss, lay the answers to what had happened to 12 experienced oil workers. The security footage had shown something large moving in those depths, and the captain's final log entry suggested he'd seen something that defied explanation. Tomorrow, we'd find out what secrets the deep water was hiding. The dive bell's mechanical systems hummed to life as the first gray light of dawn touched the Perseus's deck. I'd been awake for an hour already, running through equipment checks and trying to shake off the unsettling dreams that had plagued what little sleep I'd managed. Nancy appeared beside me at the dive control station, fully suited and carrying what looked like additional sampling containers. Her movements had a practiced efficiency that suggested she'd been preparing for this specific dive longer than the rest of us. "Ready?" she asked, though her tone carried more anticipation than question. "Guy's in position at the control room," I confirmed, checking the communications link.
Barbara's standing by in medical. Wayne's coordinating the descent systems. The dive bell itself was a cramped but reliable piece of equipment, a steel sphere equipped with life support, communications, and observation ports. As we sealed ourselves inside, I noticed Nancy had positioned her gear in a way that blocked my view of some of her instruments. "Control room to dive bell," Guy's voice crackled through the comm system. "All systems green for descent. Barbara confirms medical readiness." "Wayne here," came the second voice, though something in his tone sounded strained. "Descent equipment operational. Beginning descent sequence." The winch systems engaged with a mechanical groan, and the dive bell dropped away from the Perseus's hull into the murky Gulf waters. Through the observation port, I watched the rig's massive support columns disappear into the gloom above us as we descended. At 200 feet, the last traces of natural light faded, leaving us dependent on the bell's external illumination. Schools of fish moved through our light beams like living clouds, their silver scales reflecting our passage. Nancy had her face pressed to the opposite port, studying the water with an intensity that seemed excessive for routine observations. "Anything specific you're looking for?" I asked. "Just documenting the marine life. The depth profile here should support several species I haven't encountered before." Guy's voice came through the comm again, reading depth and pressure measurements that matched my instruments exactly. 500 feet, descent rate steady, all systems nominal. Nancy was taking notes on a waterproof tablet, occasionally checking her dive computer. Her equipment looked standard enough, though I noticed she had more backup instruments than most researchers typically carried. 800 feet, Guy announced. "Wait, I'm getting some unusual sonar readings. There's something down there that wasn't on the original surveys." Through the observation port, our lights began illuminating what looked like a perfectly circular depression in the seafloor. The formation appeared artificial, too precise and symmetrical to be natural geological activity. The walls were smooth, almost polished, descending into darkness beyond our sonar's range. "That's impossible," I said, studying the formation. "The Perseus has been surveying this area for months. Something this size would have appeared on every geological scan." Nancy leaned forward, studying the formation intently. "Geological surveys can miss features depending on sediment layers and survey angles. We should investigate while we have the opportunity. Not without proper surveying first. We need to map the formation, run additional sonar sweeps, check with Guy about the original survey data. Of course, but we should at least get a closer look. If this is a new geological phenomenon, preliminary observations could be valuable." Her interest seemed professional enough, though something about her eagerness nagged at me. Most scientists I'd worked with were more cautious about deviating from planned dive parameters. Wayne's voice came through the comm, sounding more strained than before. "Descent equipment is functioning, but I'm getting some irregular readings from the winch systems. Nothing critical, just unusual stress patterns." "Define unusual," I requested. "Like something's pulling against the descent cables. Probably just current variations, but I've never seen this pattern before." Guy's monitoring became increasingly erratic as we approached the trench bottom. "I'm showing equipment malfunctions on multiple systems, but I can't replicate them from up here. It's like the problems are resolving themselves before I can identify the cause." At 1,500 feet, our lights began revealing something extraordinary. Bioluminescent organisms unlike anything I'd encountered in 20 years of deep water operations drifted through the water column. They pulsed with rhythmic light patterns that seemed almost organized, like a form of communication. Nancy immediately began collecting samples with the containers she'd brought, working with practiced efficiency. Her collection technique was more sophisticated than I'd expected, using specialized preservation methods that suggested extensive deep-water sampling experience. "These are remarkable specimens," she said, photographing the creatures with a high-resolution underwater camera. "The bioluminescent patterns are unlike anything in current taxonomic classifications. The organisms seem to react to our presence, their light patterns shifting from random pulses to coordinated sequences.
Some clustered around the dive bell as if curious about our intrusion into their environment. Guy's voice crackled through the comm with increasing tension. I'm reading massive equipment failures across multiple systems, but everything appears functional from my position. Either my instruments are malfunctioning, or something down there is interfering with our electronics. At 2,000 feet, our descent lights illuminated the impossible. A massive stone structure emerged from the sediment at the trench bottom, its architecture defying every principle of conventional engineering. The geometric patterns carved into its surface hurt to look at directly, creating optical illusions that made my eyes water and my head ache. The proportions were wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Corridors that seemed to extend infinitely despite being enclosed. Chambers with angles that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. The structure was ancient beyond measurement, yet showed no signs of the marine growth that should have covered anything submerged for more than a few decades. The stone itself looked polished, as if the crushing depths and corrosive seawater had no effect on its composition. Nancy's reaction was immediate and intense. She pressed against the observation port, studying the structure with what looked like recognition rather than surprise. "This is extraordinary," she breathed. "The architectural patterns suggest a completely unknown civilization." "How can you determine that from here?" I asked, watching her examine the structure with suspicious familiarity. "The geometric principles are unlike any known historical architecture. We need to document this thoroughly." She began photographing the structure from every angle, her movements suggesting she knew exactly what details to capture. Something about her behavior felt rehearsed, as if she'd been preparing for this specific discovery. Through the observation port, the stone structure seemed to extend far beyond our light's reach, disappearing into the abyssal darkness like a submerged city. Whatever civilization had constructed this place, they'd possessed engineering capabilities that surpassed modern understanding. Nancy continued her documentation with an intensity that went beyond scientific curiosity, and I found myself wondering exactly what kind of research had brought her to our team. The air recycling system in the dive bell cycled with mechanical precision as I studied the stone structure spread out below us. Nancy had positioned herself at the controls, checking depth readings and communication links while I tried to process what we were looking at. The architecture defied every principle of engineering I'd learned in 20 years of marine operations. "We need to investigate that structure," Nancy said, her voice carrying a certainty that bothered me. "The geological significance alone makes this discovery unprecedented." "Investigate how? We're 2,000 feet underwater in a dive bell. This isn't exactly equipped for archaeological surveys." "The external manipulation arms are designed for sample collection. We could use them to clear debris, get closer to the structure itself." Her suggestion made sense technically, but something about her eagerness felt wrong. Most scientists I'd worked with approached unknown formations with more caution, especially at crushing depths where one mistake could kill everyone aboard. Nancy was already operating the dive bell's external arms, clearing sediment from what appeared to be a collapsed section in the structure's outer wall. Her movements showed practiced efficiency with the equipment, as if she'd rehearsed these exact maneuvers. "How long have you been planning this dive?" I asked, watching her work. "Planning what?" "We're investigating geological formations discovered during routine search operations." "Right, routine." The collapsed wall section revealed an opening large enough for human passage, though the idea of leaving our protective sphere at this depth should have been impossible. Nancy began checking her diving gear with the methodical attention of someone preparing for something specific. "You're not seriously considering going in there?" "The structure appears stable, and our suits are rated for this depth. We have limited time before our air supply requires ascent." She paused, meeting my eyes through her dive mask. "This could be the most significant archaeological discovery in human history." Her logic was sound, but her confidence about the structure's stability seemed based on more than visual observation. Nancy had brought diving equipment I hadn't seen during our gear checks, including what looked like specialized lighting and sampling tools. Guy's voice crackled through the comm system, though the signal carried more static than before. "Surface control to dive bell. I'm reading some unusual stress patterns on your support cables. Everything secure down there?" "Secured," I responded, though Nancy was already preparing to leave the bell. "We're investigating a geological formation. May need extended time at depth." "Copy that. Barbara's standing by in medical. Wayne's monitoring the descent systems, but he's reporting some irregularities in the equipment readings." Nancy had already attached her external lighting to her diving gear and checked her air supply twice. Her preparation suggested someone who'd anticipated this exact scenario, not someone making impulsive decisions based on unexpected discoveries. "We go in together," I decided. 30 minutes maximum. Any sign of structural instability, we abort immediately. Agreed. The dive bell's airlock cycled us through into the crushing darkness of the deep ocean. Our suit lights penetrated perhaps 20 feet through the murky water, illuminating the stone opening that shouldn't exist. Nancy moved toward the opening with purposeful strokes, navigating the current and debris field with surprising skill. Her underwater maneuvering displayed more experience than most marine biologists possessed, suggesting extensive technical diving background she hadn't mentioned. We passed through the collapsed wall section into a corridor that defied rational understanding. The passage extended beyond our light's reach, lined with carved stone that formed geometric patterns my eyes couldn't focus on properly. The proportions felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The ceiling seemed both too low and impossibly high, while the walls appeared to curve inward and outward simultaneously. Nancy swam ahead with movements that suggested familiarity rather than exploration. Her light beam swept across junction points and architectural features as if she was following a mental map of the structure's layout. The water inside the corridors felt different, denser somehow, with currents that moved in directions that shouldn't be possible in an enclosed space. My depth gauge showed consistent readings, but pressure variations suggested we were ascending and descending despite swimming level. We reached a chamber where the architecture became actively disturbing. The room's dimensions shifted depending on viewing angle, creating spaces that seemed larger from inside than their walls should contain. Carved symbols covered every surface, forming patterns that hurt to examine directly and made my head ache with a pressure that felt unrelated to our depth. Nancy photographed everything with systematic thoroughness, documenting symbols and architectural details with equipment more sophisticated than standard underwater cameras. Her collection methods showed preparation for this specific environment, not improvised scientific documentation. "How did you know about this place?" I asked through the comm system. "I didn't. We're discovering it together. Your navigation suggests otherwise." "I'm following logical architectural principles. Ancient civilizations often used consistent design patterns." Her explanation sounded reasonable, but her confident movement through impossible corridors contradicted her claims of spontaneous discovery. Nancy had positioned herself ahead of me throughout our exploration, leading us deeper into the structure as if she knew exactly where we were going. The central chamber opened before us like a cathedral, designed by minds that understood geometries beyond human comprehension. The space curved upward into darkness that our lights couldn't penetrate, supported by columns that twisted through dimensions my brain refused to process properly. At the chamber's center sat a pedestal carved from the same impossible stone as the walls. Resting on its surface was a crystalline sphere roughly the size of a basketball, pulsing with internal blue light that seemed to emanate from its core without illuminating its surroundings. The artifact generated a low harmonic frequency that penetrated our diving suits and made my teeth ache. The sound felt familiar in ways that disturbed me, like hearing a melody from childhood nightmares. My depth readings fluctuated wildly in the sphere's presence, as if the device was affecting our instrument's basic functions. Nancy approached the pedestal with movements that suggested reverence rather than scientific curiosity. She circled the artifact, photographing it from multiple angles while maintaining a careful distance that implied respect for its power rather than caution about unknown dangers. "This is extraordinary," she said, though her tone carried satisfaction rather than surprise. "The crystalline structure appears to be generating its own energy source.
We should document its position before considering removal. Of course, but we need to collect samples for proper analysis. Nancy began unpacking equipment I hadn't seen in her gear during our surface preparations. Specialized containment vessels, analysis tools, and what appeared to be extraction implements designed specifically for handling crystalline artifacts. Her preparedness for this exact discovery eliminated any possibility of coincidence. The walls surrounding the chamber displayed carved murals depicting scenes that made my skin crawl despite the protective layer of my diving suit. Humanoid figures knelt before massive tentacled creatures emerging from ocean depths, their poses suggesting worship rather than fear. The artistic style was ancient beyond measurement, yet the carved details showed precision that rivaled modern sculpting techniques. The sphere's pulsing intensified as Nancy approached with her extraction equipment. My depth gauge began spinning wildly, while pressure readings fluctuated in patterns that defied physics. The harmonic frequency increased, creating vibrations I could feel through the water and into my bones. Fighting against compulsions that didn't feel like my own thoughts, I found myself reaching toward the artifact. The urge to touch its surface felt overwhelming, as if the sphere was calling to something deep in my brain that predated rational thought. Nancy noticed my movement and positioned herself between me and the pedestal. "Don't touch it directly," she warned, though her tone suggested knowledge rather than caution. "We need to handle it properly." "Handle it how? This isn't a routine sample collection." "I have the appropriate equipment." Nancy connected her extraction tools to the sphere using techniques that suggested extensive training in handling similar artifacts. Her movements showed practiced efficiency with procedures I'd never encountered in marine archaeology, as if she'd performed identical extractions before. The moment her equipment made contact with the crystalline surface, the chamber's atmosphere changed. The water around us became thicker, more resistant to movement, while currents shifted in directions that violated basic physics. My depth readings became meaningless, showing measurements that ranged from negative numbers to depths exceeding the ocean floor. Nancy worked with focused determination, carefully securing the sphere in a specialized containment vessel that looked more like military equipment than scientific gear. Her protective handling suggested she understood the artifact's properties better than someone encountering it for the first time. As soon as the sphere left its pedestal, the structure began producing grinding sounds that penetrated the water and our diving suits. Stone dust drifted through the chamber like underwater snow, while pressure waves indicated massive structural movement somewhere within the ancient walls. Water started seeping through cracks that hadn't existed moments before, creating currents that pulled us toward previously solid surfaces. The chamber's impossible geometry began collapsing, with walls folding inward through dimensions that hurt to perceive directly. Nancy clutched her containment vessel with protective urgency that went beyond scientific interest. Her behavior toward the artifact felt possessive, as if she was guarding something personally valuable rather than securing a research specimen for study. "We need to leave now," I said, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the chamber's exit. The corridors leading back to our entry point had changed, with passages that showed different layouts than our approach route. Nancy navigated the altered architecture with suspicious confidence, leading us through shortcuts that shouldn't exist in a structure we just explored for the first time. Sections of the ceiling collapsed behind us as we swam through corridors that were folding into configurations my mind couldn't process. Stone blocks weighing several tons crashed through the water around us, creating pressure waves that threatened to crush our diving suits. Nancy maintained her grip on the containment vessel throughout our escape, protecting the artifact with movements that suggested its preservation was more important than our survival. Her priorities felt wrong for someone whose primary concern should have been returning safely to the surface. We reached the collapsed wall section as the entire structure began grinding itself into rubble. The ancient stone was disintegrating in patterns that suggested the building was designed to self-destruct if its contents were removed. Water pressure shifted dramatically as thousands of tons of architecture collapsed into the abyssal depths. Our emergency ascent began as chunks of impossible masonry crashed past us into the darkness below.
Nancy clutched her prize throughout our rapid rise, her body language protective rather than scientific. Whatever she'd found in that central chamber, she was treating it like something she'd been sent to retrieve, rather than something we'd discovered together. The dive bell's lights appeared above us like salvation, though Nancy's behavior suggested our mission was just beginning rather than ending. She'd gotten what she came for, and her secretive preparation was becoming impossible to ignore. As we approached the safety of our pressure vessel, I realized Nancy had never intended this to be a rescue mission at all. The decompression procedure took 40 minutes after our emergency ascent, but even sitting in the Meridian's medical bay, breathing pure oxygen, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed during those hours underwater. Nancy sat across from me, her containment vessel secured between her feet, like she was guarding something more valuable than her own life. The way she checked the seals every few minutes suggested this wasn't her first time transporting artifacts that needed special handling. Barbara ran standard post-dive medical checks on both of us, her movements efficient but distracted. She kept glancing at Nancy's equipment with the kind of professional curiosity that meant she was noticing details that didn't add up. When she tested my blood pressure for the third time, I realized her concern wasn't about decompression sickness. "Everything normal," she announced, though her tone carried questions she wasn't asking aloud. Guy appeared in the medical bay doorway before we'd finished the safety protocols, his face showing the kind of strain that meant he'd been monitoring our dive communications and calculating worst-case scenarios. His hands shook slightly as he helped us move our gear to the main cabin, and I noticed him checking his phone obsessively, more frequently than usual, as if his financial anxieties had intensified. "Did you find anything that explains the crew disappearance?" he asked, though his attention kept drifting to Nancy's sealed container. "We documented significant geological formations," Nancy replied carefully. "The site requires additional analysis before we can determine relevance to our investigation." Wayne joined us as we transferred equipment from the medical bay, carrying diving gear with mechanical precision that suggested he was following routine procedures to avoid thinking about what we'd discovered. His usual steady demeanor showed cracks around the edges, and when I asked him about the winch irregularities he'd reported during our descent, he paused, touching his temple. "Winch problems?" Yes. I remember mentioning something, but the details feel fuzzy now, like trying to remember a dream. I studied his face, looking for signs he was joking or testing my attention to detail. Wayne's memory for technical problems was usually flawless, but something was clearly affecting his normally reliable recall. "You said something was pulling against the descent cables. Unusual stress patterns." "Right. That sounds familiar. But when I check the equipment logs, everything shows normal operation. Maybe I was imagining things." Nancy had positioned herself in the main cabin's center, placing her containment vessel on the bolted-down table where it would remain stable regardless of sea conditions. The way she arranged her other equipment around it suggested she was setting up for extended analysis work rather than temporary storage. The sealed container hummed with barely audible vibrations that I felt through the deck plates rather than heard through the air. The sound created a persistent pressure behind my eyes that intensified whenever I looked directly at the vessel. Barbara noticed me rubbing my temples and handed me standard painkillers, but the headache felt too specific to respond to conventional medication. "Something's wrong with the atmospheric pressure readings," Wayne announced from the navigation station, though when I checked the barometric instruments, everything appeared normal. Guy sat down across from Nancy's equipment setup, his phone still in his hand, but forgotten as his usual nervous energy was replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. For 3 days, he'd been checking messages constantly, but now the device seemed irrelevant compared to whatever was occupying his thoughts. "Can you hear that?" he asked, tilting his head toward Nancy's container. "Hear what?" "The humming, like voices but too quiet to understand the words." I listened carefully, trying to isolate any sounds beyond the ship's normal operations and the equipment vibrations. The Meridian's engines provided steady background noise, punctuated by occasional creaks from the hull adjusting to wave motion, but I couldn't identify anything resembling voices. Nancy began unpacking analysis equipment I'd never seen during our mission preparations. Sophisticated instruments that looked more expensive than our entire contract value, with manufacturer labels I didn't recognize, and technical specifications that seemed designed for purposes beyond marine biology research. "Where did this equipment come from?" I asked, watching her assemble what appeared to be a spectrographic analyzer. "Standard research instruments. I brought them as precautionary gear. You never know what kind of analysis capabilities you'll need in deep water research. My university maintains specialized equipment for unusual discoveries. This wasn't listed in your gear inventory. Emergency research protocols. When you're dealing with unknown geological formations, it's better to have analysis capabilities and not need them than to make a significant discovery and lack the tools to properly document it." Her explanation sounded reasonable, but her confident handling of instruments suggested she'd used them extensively before today. Most researchers I'd worked with needed time to familiarize themselves with complex equipment, especially under field conditions. Nancy operated her devices with the efficiency of someone who'd practiced these exact procedures. Barbara checked her medical supplies while Nancy worked, discovering that several containers had been disturbed. She held up empty medication bottles with confusion that suggested she remembered packing them differently. "I could have sworn I had more sedatives than this, and someone's been into my testing supplies." "Equipment shifts during operations," I offered, though something about the disturbance patterns looked deliberate rather than accidental. "Not shifted, used. Someone's been taking medications and contaminating my testing equipment." Wayne wandered between different areas of the ship, checking systems with the restless energy of someone who couldn't settle into normal routines. When I found him staring at the engine room controls with complete bewilderment, my concern shifted from routine stress to something more serious. "Everything operational down here?" "I think so. I can't remember why I came down here, though. Was I supposed to check something specific?" "You mentioned irregular readings during our dive. Wanted to verify the engines were running properly." "Right. That makes sense. The engines are fine, though I'm not sure how long I've been standing here." Guy remained motionless at the main cabin table, his attention fixed on Nancy's containment vessel with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. His usual nervous habits had disappeared, replaced by a stillness that felt unnatural for someone with his temperament. "Guy, you need to eat something. None of us have had a meal since this morning." He looked at me with an expression that suggested he'd forgotten food was necessary for human survival. "I'm not hungry. Haven't thought about eating since we came back up." The mention of food made me realize I'd also lost track of basic biological needs. The discovery felt disturbing rather than convenient, as if something was suppressing normal human instincts that should have demanded attention after hours of physical exertion. Nancy's analysis equipment generated readouts that filled multiple screens with data I couldn't interpret. Wavelength measurements, energy patterns, and electromagnetic readings that suggested her artifact was more complex than crystalline mineral formations. The numbers kept changing in patterns that seemed too organized to represent natural phenomena. "What exactly are you measuring?" I asked, studying the displays over her shoulder.
"Crystalline structure analysis. The artifact appears to be generating energy through unknown processes. These readings could revolutionize our understanding of mineral compositions. Those look like electromagnetic signatures, not geological measurements. Advanced mineral analysis requires multiple measurement techniques. The energy patterns indicate this isn't a simple crystal formation." Barbara joined us at the equipment station, bringing her medical knowledge to bear on Nancy's data. Her expression shifted from curiosity to concern as she studied the electromagnetic readings. "Those energy patterns look familiar. They're similar to brainwave measurements, but at frequencies I've never seen in human neurological activity." "Interesting observation," Nancy replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't surprised by the correlation. Guy suddenly spoke from his position at the table, his voice carrying an odd inflection that made us all turn toward him. It's trying to communicate. The voices are getting clearer. Wayne reappeared from below deck, looking disoriented and carrying tools he couldn't explain. Found myself in the engine room again. I was adjusting something, but I can't remember what or why.
Wayne, how many times have you been down there today? I don't know. Time feels different since we came back up. Like hours are passing without me noticing.
Barbara checked her watch, discovering that our post-dive activities had consumed more time than any of us remembered. The evening was well advanced, though none of us could account for where the hours had gone. We should establish normal routines, she suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. Regular meals, sleep schedules, structured activities to maintain psychological stability. I'm not tired, Guy said without looking away from Nancy's equipment. Don't need sleep when there's so much to learn. Nancy continued her analysis work with single-minded focus, occasionally making notes in a waterproof journal she kept positioned where none of us could read her observations. Her documentation methods looked more like intelligence gathering than scientific research, recording specific details with the precision of someone completing a predetermined checklist. The ship's communication equipment crackled with static that formed almost recognizable patterns, like voices speaking languages that sounded familiar but remained incomprehensible. Wayne tried adjusting the radio frequencies, but the interference persisted regardless of technical modifications. Could be atmospheric disturbance, he suggested, though his explanation lacked his usual technical confidence. Or equipment malfunction, I offered, though the patterns in the static felt too organized to represent random electronic failure. Guy stood up abruptly from the table, moving toward Nancy's containment vessel with movements that looked involuntary rather than conscious. His hands reached toward the sealed container before he caught himself and stepped back. It wants me to touch it, keeps showing me things I need to understand. Showing you things how? Barbara asked, shifting into medical evaluation mode. Pictures in my head, ancient places underwater, creatures that ruled the oceans before humans existed. The sphere remembers everything. Nancy looked up from her equipment for the first time since beginning her analysis, studying Guy with an expression that combined professional interest with something resembling satisfaction. Describe these images more specifically. Details could be scientifically significant. Cities with impossible architecture. Beings that swam through dimensions we can't perceive. The sphere was their technology, designed to preserve knowledge across geological ages. And you're receiving this information directly from the artifact? It's not receiving, it's remembering. The sphere recognizes me from somewhere, but I can't identify when or where we've encountered each other before. Barbara approached Guy with medical caution, checking his pupils and pulse while he remained fixated on Nancy's equipment. His vital signs showed patterns she clearly found concerning, though she kept her observations private. Wayne disappeared again during our conversation, reappearing 20 minutes later from the cargo hold, with no explanation for his absence. When questioned, he looked confused about his activities and couldn't recall leaving the main cabin. Maybe I was checking security or looking for something. The details feel important, but I can't bring them into focus. Night fell around the meridian while we grappled with experiences that defied rational explanation. None of us felt hungry despite skipping multiple meals. None of us felt tired despite hours of physical and psychological stress. And none of us could maintain normal conversation without drifting into topics related to Nancy's artifact. The sphere itself remained sealed in its containment vessel, pulsing with blue light that penetrated the metal walls and cast shifting shadows throughout the main cabin. The illumination felt wrong somehow, creating visual effects that hurt to observe directly and made familiar objects appear strange and threatening. Nancy continued working through the evening, her analysis producing results that she recorded in her private journal while sharing only general observations with the rest of us. Her behavior suggested she was gathering specific information for purposes beyond our stated mission. As the hours passed, I realized that whatever we'd brought up from the abyss was changing all of us in ways I couldn't yet understand. The galley felt wrong when I woke up. though it took me several minutes to figure out why. I'd fallen asleep in the main cabin chair, my neck stiff from the awkward position. But something about the morning light filtering through the portholes seemed off, too blue, maybe, or coming from the wrong direction entirely. Guy hadn't moved from his spot at the table. He sat in exactly the same position I remembered from the night before, staring at Nancy's containment vessel with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His phone lay forgotten beside his elbow, the screen dark and apparently irrelevant compared to whatever was holding his attention. "Guy, you've been sitting there all night?" He looked at me with eyes that seemed to focus from a great distance. "It's been showing me things. Cities under the water, older than anything humans ever built. The people who lived there, they weren't like us. You need sleep, real sleep, in an actual bed. Sleep is wasted time now. There's too much to learn, too much to understand before it's too late." Nancy emerged from the forward cabin where she'd supposedly been resting, though she looked as alert and focused as she had during her analysis work the previous evening. Her movements carried the precision of someone who'd been awake and active, not someone who'd just woken up. "The electromagnetic patterns intensified during the night," she announced, checking her equipment displays. "The energy signatures are becoming more complex, almost like the artifact is developing enhanced capabilities." "Enhanced how?" "Communication protocols. The patterns are starting to resemble neural activity, but with organizational structures beyond anything found in human brain function." Guy nodded along with her explanation, as if it confirmed something he already knew. "It's trying to teach us about the old world, the civilization that built those underwater cities. They had technology we can't imagine." Barbara appeared from the medical bay, carrying her supply kit with movements that suggested she'd been conducting inventory rather than sleeping. Her expression combined professional concern with confusion as she joined us in the main cabin. "Someone's been into my medications again," she said, holding up several empty containers. "Not just missing doses. Everything's been systematically contaminated. My testing supplies, my sterile equipment, even my emergency sedatives." "Contaminated how?" "Exposed to moisture, mixed with other substances. Like someone was experimenting with different combinations." She looked directly at Guy. "Have you been taking anything from my medical supplies?" "I don't need medications. The sphere is better than any drug for expanding consciousness." Nancy moved closer to Guy's position at the table, positioning herself where she could observe both him and her equipment simultaneously. Guy's observations about enhanced consciousness could be scientifically significant. If the artifact is generating neurological effects, that represents a completely new category of discovery. "Nancy, we're talking about contaminated medical supplies and a team member who hasn't slept in over 12 hours. This isn't a research opportunity. Every aspect of our experience here could provide crucial data. Guy's neurological responses might be the key to understanding how the artifact interfaces with human brain function." Her words seemed to energize Guy rather than calm him. He stood up from the table with sudden movement that made us all step back instinctively. "She understands," he said, gesturing toward Nancy. "The sphere chose her to witness the truth. The rest of you are trying to suppress what it's revealing." Wayne emerged from below deck, looking disoriented and carrying tools he couldn't explain. When he saw us gathered around the table, his expression shifted to confusion that went deeper than simple morning grogginess. "I was working on something in the engine room," he said slowly, "but I can't remember what or why. I can't even remember how I got down there." "Wayne, do you remember what you were working on yesterday, during our dive operations?" He touched his temple, concentrating with visible effort. "Yesterday feels like years ago. I remember the ship, I remember diving equipment, but the details..." He trailed off, studying his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "I'm not sure I remember my own name correctly." Barbara immediately shifted into medical evaluation mode, checking Wayne's pupils and asking basic orientation questions. His responses revealed gaps that went far beyond simple fatigue or stress. He couldn't recall his hometown, his family, or even basic details about his professional background. "This is serious neurological impairment," Barbara told me quietly. "Memory loss, this comprehensive, usually indicates significant brain trauma or chemical interference." Guy laughed from his position near Nancy's equipment, the sound carrying an edge that made everyone turn toward him. "Wayne's brain is clearing out the irrelevant information, making room for what the sphere needs to teach us." "Guy, Wayne can't remember his own identity. That's not consciousness expansion, that's brain damage." "Brain damage or brain improvement? Why cling to random personal details when you could understand truths about the universe?" Nancy watched this exchange with an expression that combined scientific curiosity with something that looked like satisfaction. She made notes in her waterproof journal while Guy spoke, documenting his responses with the attention of someone gathering specific information. I decided we needed to take control of the situation before it deteriorated further. "Barbara, prepare a mild sedative for Guy. Something to help him get actual rest." "Absolutely not," Guy said, his voice rising. "You're trying to silence what the sphere is revealing. It's showing me the ancient civilization that ruled the oceans before humans existed, and you want to drug me into forgetting. Guy, you've been awake for over 15 hours, staring at that container. Your mind isn't processing information clearly. My mind is processing information more clearly than it ever has. The sphere is teaching me about their technology, their cities, their knowledge of dimensional travel. They weren't destroyed. They retreated to deeper waters, waiting for the right moment to return." Barbara approached with a prepared syringe, moving carefully to avoid triggering Guy's growing agitation. "This is just a mild relaxant. Nothing that will harm you or interfere with your thinking." Guy backed away from her, positioning himself protectively near Nancy's containment vessel. "I won't let you suppress the truth. The sphere chose me to receive these visions for a reason." "What visions, specifically?" Nancy asked, encouraging him to continue rather than trying to calm him down. "Vast cities with architecture that defies physics. Beings that moved through water like air, with intelligence beyond human comprehension. They built the sphere as a communication device, a way to preserve their knowledge across geological ages. And this civilization, they're still active? They're waiting. The sphere is calling to them, letting them know it's been recovered. They'll return to reclaim their technology and their rightful place as rulers of the ocean." Barbara looked at me with alarm, clearly recognizing that Guy's delusions were becoming more elaborate and potentially dangerous. When she tried to approach him again with the sedative, he grabbed a diving knife from the equipment rack. "Stay away from me, all of you. You're trying to prevent me from completing my purpose." The knife looked serious in Guy's hands, though his movements suggested he was responding to threats only he could perceive. Nancy stepped closer to him rather than backing away, her behavior encouraging his defensive posture. "Guy's right about the significance of his experiences," she said. "We should document everything he's seeing rather than suppressing it with medications. Nancy, he's armed and experiencing severe psychological disturbance. This isn't a research opportunity. The artifact is providing unprecedented access to prehistoric knowledge. Guy's visions could revolutionize our understanding of ancient civilizations." Wayne wandered closer to our group, his expression vacant as he struggled with basic cognitive function. "I remember something about water, being underwater, but I can't place when or where." Guy turned the knife toward Wayne, his grip tightening as paranoia replaced confusion. "You're not supposed to be here. The sphere showed me. You're an imposter, sent to steal the artifact for people who would misuse its power." "Guy, that's Wayne. He's been with our team since Houston." "No, look at his eyes. That's not Wayne anymore. Something else is wearing his face, trying to get close to the sphere." Barbara tried to position herself between Guy and Wayne, but Guy's focus had locked onto Wayne with frightening intensity. The diving knife trembled in his grip as competing impulses fought for control of his actions. "The sphere is warning me about him," Guy said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He's here to destroy what we've discovered. I have to protect it." Without warning, Guy lunged forward and drove the knife into Wayne's chest. The blade sliced through fabric and skin, opening a gash that immediately began bleeding heavily. Wayne stumbled backward, looking down at his wound with confusion rather than pain. I tackled Guy before he could strike again, wrestling the knife away from him, while Wayne collapsed against the equipment rack. Barbara immediately moved to treat Wayne's injury, applying pressure to the wound while Guy struggled beneath my restraining hold. "You don't understand," Guy screamed. "The sphere showed me the truth about him. He's not human anymore. None of you are listening to what it's trying to tell us." Nancy stood over our struggle, watching Guy's breakdown with clinical detachment, rather than helping to restrain him. Her priorities seemed focused on protecting her equipment, rather than preventing violence among the team. Barbara worked frantically to stop Wayne's bleeding, her medical training taking over as she applied bandages and pressure dressings. "The wound is deep, but manageable if I can prevent shock and infection. Wayne, stay with me. Focus on my voice." Guy broke free from my grip with strength that seemed unnatural, fueled by adrenaline and whatever psychological state the artifact had induced. He grabbed Nancy's containment vessel and backed toward the cabin door. "I'm taking the sphere where you can't interfere with its mission. It has work to finish, preparations to make for when they return." Before I could stop him, Guy had barricaded himself in the forward cabin with Nancy's equipment. The sound of furniture being moved indicated he was creating a defensive position, while muffled voices suggested he was continuing his conversations with invisible entities. Guy opened the door. "We need to discuss this rationally." "There's nothing to discuss," came his response through the locked cabin. "The sphere has shown me everyone's true intentions. You're all trying to prevent the return of the rightful ocean rulers." Nancy approached the cabin door, but instead of trying to calm Guy, her words seemed designed to encourage his delusions. "Guy, I understand what the artifact is showing you. The ancient civilization you're seeing, they really existed. Their technology could change everything. You believe me? The electromagnetic patterns confirm your visions are based on actual information stored in the sphere. You're receiving genuine historical data about prehistoric ocean dwellers." Barbara looked up from treating Wayne's wound, her expression horrified, as she realized Nancy was making Guy's condition worse rather than better. "Nancy, he's experiencing severe psychological breakdown. You're reinforcing dangerous delusions." "I'm acknowledging scientific evidence. Guy's visions correlate with measurable energy patterns from the artifact." Through the cabin door, Guy's voice continued in conversation with entities only he could perceive. His tone alternated between pleading and commanding, as if he was negotiating with invisible authorities about the sphere's proper handling. "The old ones are angry that their technology was buried," he said. "They want assurances that it will be used to prepare for their return, not studied by people who lack proper understanding." Nancy pressed closer to the door, encouraging Guy to continue. "What preparations are they requesting? How do they want the artifact to be used?" "The sphere needs to signal them. It has to be positioned where its energy can reach the deepest ocean trenches, where they've been waiting in the ancient cities." Wayne slumped against the equipment rack, his face pale from blood loss despite Barbara's medical treatment. "I remember now," he said weakly. "The diving, the structure underwater, but everything else is still gone." The sphere's pulsing intensified from behind the locked cabin door, its blue light visible through the cracks around the frame. The harmonic frequency that had been barely perceptible now resonated through the ship's hull, creating vibrations that I felt in my bones. Nancy's equipment outside the cabin began producing readings that filled her remaining screens with chaotic data streams. Energy patterns, electromagnetic signatures, and wavelength measurements that changed too rapidly for interpretation. "The artifact is activating additional functions," Nancy announced, though her tone suggested excitement rather than concern. "Nancy,
Guy is armed and experiencing complete psychological breakdown. Whatever's happening with your equipment, our priority has to be crew safety. The crew safety depends on properly handling the artifact. Guy understands its requirements better than any of us. Barbara finished bandaging Wayne's wound and helped him to a sitting position where he could rest while recovering from blood loss. Donald, I need to speak with you privately, away from the cabin door. We moved to the galley area, where Barbara lowered her voice to avoid being overheard by Guy or Nancy. Nancy's behavior isn't consistent with someone trying to help the team. Her responses to Guy's breakdown, her encouragement of his delusions, her priorities during the violence. She's acting like someone with a different agenda. Different how? Like someone who needs Guy to remain unstable. Like his connection to the artifact serves her purposes better than his recovery. Through the ship's hull, the sphere's harmonic frequency continued building, creating resonance patterns that seemed to penetrate every surface. The sound felt familiar in ways that disturbed me, like hearing music from nightmares I couldn't quite remember. Wayne struggled to his feet, supporting himself against the galley counter. The humming is getting stronger. I can almost understand what it's saying. What do you mean, understand? Like words, but not in any language I recognize. Pictures forming in my head of places I've never been. Barbara checked Wayne's wound dressing, ensuring the bleeding had stopped before he attempted movement. Wayne, describe these pictures. Details might help us understand what's affecting everyone's mental state. Underwater spaces, massive caverns filled with structures that hurt to look at directly. Creatures that move through water like they're flying, with intelligence that makes humans seem primitive. The images Wayne described matched Guy's visions, suggesting the artifact was affecting multiple team members with consistent hallucinations. But the precision of the shared experience felt too organized to represent random psychological symptoms. Nancy continued her analysis work outside the locked cabin, documenting whatever data the sphere was generating. Her movements showed the focused efficiency of someone completing a predetermined mission rather than responding to unexpected developments. "Nancy," I called. "We need to discuss evacuation procedures. If Guy's condition continues deteriorating, we may need to request emergency medical assistance." Evacuation would be premature. Guy's experiences represent the first direct communication with prehistoric intelligence in human history. We can't abandon this opportunity for momentary safety concerns. Momentary safety concerns? He just stabbed Wayne and barricaded himself with potentially dangerous equipment. The artifact isn't dangerous. It's revolutionary. Guy's connection to its stored information could provide insights that transform human understanding of ocean history. From the locked cabin came the sound of Guy's voice raised in what seemed like argument with his invisible companions. His words became increasingly urgent, as if he was defending his actions to entities that questioned his judgment. "I protected the sphere like you instructed," he said. "The imposter tried to steal it, but I prevented the theft. Now it's safe from people who would misuse its power." The blue light emanating from the cabin intensified, casting moving shadows throughout the main area that seemed to shift independent of any actual light source. The shadows formed shapes that resembled tentacles or reaching arms, though looking directly at them made the images dissolve into ordinary darkness. Wayne pointed toward the shadowy movement with a trembling hand. "You can see them too, the shapes in the shadows. They're not hallucinations." Barbara followed his gesture, her medical training making her approach the phenomenon analytically rather than fearfully. Visual disturbances could indicate electromagnetic interference with neurological function. The artifact might be generating fields that affect perception. "Or it's showing us things that are actually there," Nancy suggested. "If the sphere contains technology beyond human understanding, it might reveal aspects of reality we normally can't perceive." The shadows continued moving through areas where no light source should create them, forming patterns that suggested intelligence rather than random optical effects.
Tentacle-like shapes reached across surfaces, while other configurations resembled massive eyes observing our activities. Guy's voice from the cabin grew more agitated as his conversation with invisible entities became increasingly confrontational. I won't give it back to them. The sphere chose me to be its guardian. I understand its purpose now. Guy, who are you talking to? Nancy called through the door. The old ones are angry that their technology was disturbed. They want to reclaim the sphere and punish everyone who interfered with its resting place. Tell them we're here to help. We want to understand their civilization and preserve their knowledge. They don't trust humans with their technology. Too primitive, too destructive. They're considering whether to destroy the sphere rather than let it remain in inadequate hands. The conversation between Guy and his invisible companions suggested a complex negotiation about the artifact's fate. His responses indicated he was receiving detailed information about expectations and consequences related to the sphere's handling. Wayne slumped further against the galley counter, his strength depleted by blood loss and whatever psychological effects the artifact continued producing. The images are getting clearer. I can see the cities Guy described. Ancient architecture that doesn't follow normal geometry. Wayne, focus on staying conscious. Don't let the visions overwhelm your awareness of reality. Reality doesn't feel solid anymore. The boundaries between what's real and what's vision keep shifting. Barbara monitored Wayne's vital signs while tracking the psychological changes affecting everyone aboard. Donald, we're dealing with neurological interference that's intensifying as the artifact becomes more active. Everyone's mental state is deteriorating. The sphere's harmonic frequency reached levels that created physical discomfort, making my teeth ache and generating pressure behind my eyes that felt like the beginning of a severe headache. The sound penetrated every surface of the ship, turning the meridian into a resonating chamber. Nancy's remaining equipment produced readouts that showed energy patterns unlike anything in her previous measurements. The displays filled with data streams that changed too rapidly for interpretation, suggesting the artifact was activating capabilities that exceeded her analytical tools. The electromagnetic signatures are beyond anything I've seen, she announced. If these readings are accurate, the sphere is generating energy levels that rival industrial power plants. Energy for what purpose? Communication. The artifact is transmitting signals that could reach anywhere in the ocean. Guy's voice from the cabin suddenly changed tone, becoming more commanding, as if he was issuing instructions rather than receiving them. Prepare the deep channels, clear the abyssal pathways. The sphere is calling the old ones home. The shadows moving through our compartment intensified, forming shapes that seemed to respond to Guy's words. Tentacle configurations reached toward areas where our equipment was stored, while eye-like patterns focused on Nancy's analytical instruments. Wayne pointed toward the shadows with increasing agitation. They're not just images anymore. I can feel them touching the walls, moving through the water around the ship. Barbara grabbed my arm, her medical training making her recognize signs that our situation was becoming critically dangerous. Donald, we need to evacuate immediately. Whatever's happening here, it's escalating beyond our ability to control. Ev, the sound of splintering wood cut through the Meridian's midnight quiet like a gunshot. I'd been dozing fitfully in the main cabin when Guy's improvised battering ram, probably the cabin's desk chair, finally broke through the door frame he'd barricaded himself behind for hours. He emerged clutching Nancy's containment vessel against his chest, the sphere's blue light casting wild shadows across his face as he stumbled into the main compartment. His eyes had the glassy quality of someone who'd abandoned rational thought entirely, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that belonged to someone else. I know what you all are, he announced, scanning the room where Nancy sat at her remaining equipment, and Barbara knelt beside Wayne's makeshift bedding. The sphere showed me everyone's true intentions. Wayne struggled to sit up despite his bandaged chest wound, his face pale but determined. Guy, put that thing down. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I ever have. Guy raised the containment vessel over his head like a club. Especially about her. his attention fixed on Nancy with an intensity that made her freeze at her equipment station. The sphere's pulsing intensified, synchronizing with Guy's agitated breathing as he took a step toward her. "Corporate spy," he said, the words carrying certainty that went beyond paranoid delusion. "Sent to steal the artifact for private collectors who pay better than government contracts." I expected Nancy to deny the accusation, to use her established cover story about university research, but instead she stood up from her equipment with movements that looked more like tactical positioning than defensive retreat. "The sphere told you that?" she asked, her voice losing the scientific curiosity that had characterized her responses for days. "The sphere showed me everything. Your real employers, your actual mission parameters, your extraction protocols." Guy's grip on the container tightened. "How long you've been tracking artifacts like this one?" Nancy didn't argue with his accusations or try to maintain her marine biology cover. Instead, she extended her hand toward the containment vessel with the confidence of someone making a reasonable business proposal. "Then you understand why I need you to hand it over, so I can complete my actual mission." Her admission hit the rest of us like cold water. Barbara stopped checking Wayne's bandages to stare at Nancy, while Wayne attempted to push himself upright despite the pain from his chest wound. "Nancy, what is he talking about?" Barbara asked, though her tone suggested she'd already started connecting pieces that hadn't fit properly. "My real name is Nancy Marino, not Dr. Sarah Chen, and I'm not affiliated with any university marine biology program." She kept her attention fixed on Guy and the sphere he held. "I'm here to recover that artifact for an organization that understands its true significance." Guy laughed, the sound containing no humor whatsoever. "True significance? You mean its market value to people who collect things that shouldn't exist? I mean its potential to revolutionize human understanding of prehistoric intelligence and dimensional technology." "Lies." Guy clutched the container closer to his chest. "The sphere showed me what happens when people like you get hold of this technology. Exploitation, weaponization, corruption of everything it was meant to preserve." Wayne managed to get his feet under him, blood seeping through his bandages as he forced himself to stand. "Guy, whatever that thing is telling you, it's not worth dying for. It's worth protecting humanity from people who would abuse its power." Without warning, Guy moved toward the deck access, clearly intending to throw the sphere overboard rather than let Nancy claim it. Wayne launched himself across the cabin despite his injuries, tackling Guy around the waist and sending both men crashing into the equipment rack. The impact jarred the containment vessel from Guy's grip, and it rolled across the tilting deck toward the galley. Guy managed to pull the diving knife from his belt as Wayne tried to wrestle him away from the artifact. The sphere's influence seemed to flood Guy with unnatural strength and pain tolerance as he drove the blade into Wayne's chest just below the previous wound. "Guy, stop!" Barbara shouted, moving toward the struggling men. Guy pulled the knife free and stabbed Wayne again, this time in the shoulder, his movements mechanical and precise rather than frenzied. Wayne's blood splattered across the deck plates as he tried to maintain his grip on Guy's wrist, but his strength was failing fast. "The sphere is protecting itself," Guy said, driving the knife into Wayne's side with strength that shouldn't have been possible given his deteriorated condition. "Eliminating threats to its mission." Barbara reached the struggle and tried to pull Guy off Wayne, but Guy spun toward her with the bloody knife raised. Before she could retreat, he lunged forward and struck her across the temple with his fist, the artifact's influence lending force to the blow that sent her stumbling backward. Barbara crashed against the galley counter, blood running from a gash above her left eye as she lost her balance and fell to the deck. The sphere's blue light pulsed brighter from where it had rolled near the door, as if feeding energy to Guy's unnatural endurance. I grabbed the emergency flare gun from the safety equipment locker we'd inventoried on our first day, my hands shaking as I tried to load the signal cartridge. Guy continued stabbing Wayne with methodical precision, each thrust accompanied by wet sounds that made my stomach lurch. "Guy, get away from him!" Guy looked up at me with an expression that combined recognition with complete indifference to my authority.
Blood covered his hands and forearms, while Wayne lay gasping beneath him, his movements growing weaker with each wound. He was trying to steal the sphere for the imposters. I had to stop him. I aimed the flare gun at Guy's center mass, knowing the phosphorus charge would create serious burns, but hoping the shock might break whatever hold the artifact had on his mind. Drop the knife and step away from Wayne. The sphere is more important than any individual life, including mine. I pulled the trigger. The flare cartridge struck Guy in the chest and immediately ignited his shirt, creating flames that spread across the fabric with unnatural speed. The artifact's influence seemed to dull his pain response. Instead of dropping the knife and trying to extinguish the fire, Guy continued his attack on Wayne's barely conscious body. The smell of burning cloth and skin filled the cabin as Guy stabbed Wayne twice more, the blade finding spaces between ribs with surgical precision. Flames climbed toward his face, but the sphere's hold on his mind made him push through agony that should have incapacitated anyone else. "Guy, you're on fire." He looked down at the flames consuming his torso with mild curiosity, as if the burning was happening to someone else. Pain is irrelevant when you're serving a higher purpose. The sphere's blue pulsing had synchronized with something else, massive movements that I felt through the hull rather than heard through the air. Nancy moved toward the rolling container with careful steps, clearly intending to claim the artifact while Guy was distracted by his burning clothes. Through the cabin portholes came flashes of bioluminescent light from outside the ship, patterns that moved through the water with intelligence rather than random marine activity. The sphere's pulsing intensified, and the answering lights from the ocean depths grew brighter. Guy finally acknowledged the flames consuming his upper body by tearing off his burning shirt, revealing severe burns that should have left him screaming in agony. The artifact's influence was sustaining him beyond normal human endurance, but his body was failing despite his mind's disconnect from the pain. "It's calling to them," he said, watching the bioluminescent patterns through the portholes. The old ones heard the sphere's signal, and they're rising from the deep cities. The water around the meridian erupted as something massive broke the surface nearby. Through the nearest porthole, I caught a glimpse of flesh that defied biological classification, surfaces covered in scales the size of dinner plates, appendages that moved with muscular coordination, and eyes that reflected our cabin lights with intelligence that felt ancient and malevolent. "Nancy!" Guy called, his voice barely audible as his injuries finally began overwhelming the sphere's influence. "You understand what's happening, don't you? Why the sphere had to be recovered?" Nancy reached the containment vessel and lifted it with reverent care, her movements suggesting she'd practiced these exact motions many times before. "I understand the artifact represents first contact with a prehistoric civilization," she said. "My organization has been tracking similar objects for years, waiting for one to become active. Your organization." Guy's burned face twisted into something resembling a smile as he collapsed to his knees. "Government contractors who think they can control forces that ruled the oceans before humans existed. We're not trying to control them. We're trying to establish communication protocols that might prevent them from viewing humanity as a threat." The ship lurched as something struck the hull below the waterline. Emergency alarms began wailing throughout the meridian as systems detected hull breaches and flooding in the lower compartments. Through the portholes, massive tentacles became visible in the water, appendages thicker than telephone poles, covered in suckers the size of manhole covers. They moved through the ocean with predatory grace, exploring the meridian's hull, like fingers examining an interesting toy. Nancy secured the sphere's container against her body with equipment straps, transforming herself into a human transport system for the artifact. The creatures respond to the sphere's energy signatures. As long as I maintain possession, they'll recognize me as an ally rather than a threat. "You're not an ally," Guy whispered, finally succumbing to his injuries and falling forward. "You're cattle that learned to mimic their communication."
One of the tentacles wrapped around the Meridian's midsection, creating pressure that made the hull plates groan in protest. Water began seeping through stressed joints as the creature tested our structural integrity. Barbara struggled to her feet despite her head wound, blood still running from the gash above her eye. "Donald, the radio equipment. We need to send a distress signal." I helped her reach the communications station, where she immediately began checking frequencies and transmission capabilities. Her expression shifted from concern to horror as she discovered what someone had done to our equipment. "The radio's been sabotaged," she announced. "Not damaged, deliberately disabled. Someone removed essential components and shorted critical circuits." The implications hit me like physical blows. Someone's been feeding information about our mission to external parties. Nancy continued securing the sphere's container while monitoring the creature activity outside. My handlers required regular updates about recovery progress. I had to work carefully during Wayne's sleep periods. He would have noticed missing components during his regular system checks, so I used bypass circuits and temporary replacements to mask the sabotage until tonight. "You've been reporting our location and status?" "Naval assets positioned outside territorial waters needed coordination points. Submarines equipped for deep-water recovery of personnel and artifacts." Another tentacle emerged from the water, this one exploring the Meridian superstructure with movements that suggested the creature was learning about human engineering. The appendage wrapped around our communications mast and began applying pressure that bent the metal supports. The sphere's influence had been building throughout our conversation, creating compulsions that I felt as physical pressure toward the nearest exit. Wayne's barely conscious form twitched with involuntary movements toward the deck access, while Guy's lifeless eyes remained fixed on the container in Nancy's arms. "It wants us outside," I said, fighting against the urge to follow the artifact's pull. "The sphere is calling us to join whatever's out there." Barbara opened the medical supply locker with hands that shook from blood loss and psychological pressure. "I need to treat Wayne's wounds before we lose him completely." The deck tilted as water flooded the lower compartments, shifting the ship's balance and making normal movement difficult. Through the portholes, more bioluminescent patterns appeared in the water. Not random marine life, but organized signals that seemed to coordinate the creature's exploration of our vessel. Nancy moved toward the deck access with purposeful steps, apparently responding to the sphere's compulsions rather than fighting them. The artifact wants to return to its natural environment. Keeping it contained on the ship is causing distress to its creators. "Nancy, don't take that thing outside. We don't know what those creatures will do." "I know exactly what they'll do. My organization has been preparing for this contact scenario for years." The engines suddenly died with a grinding sound that suggested the tentacles had crushed critical hull sections. Emergency lighting activated throughout the ship as main power systems failed, casting everything in the red glow that meant our situation had become critical. Barbara knelt beside Wayne's motionless form, checking his pulse while trying to stop the bleeding from multiple stab wounds. "Wayne's barely breathing. He needs immediate medical attention that I can't provide here." The compulsion to follow the sphere toward the deck access became overwhelming, like magnetic attraction that pulled at something deeper than conscious thought. I found myself taking steps toward Nancy and the container, despite knowing the danger of going outside. Nancy reached the deck access and began opening the sealed door, her movements showing none of the hesitation that should accompany such a dangerous decision. The sphere's blue light intensified as she approached open air, pulsing in patterns that matched the bioluminescent signals from the creatures surrounding our ship. "The old ones are waiting to reclaim their technology," she said, stepping through the doorway onto the tilting deck, "and to decide what to do about the species that disturbed their resting place." The deck tilted 40 degrees before I realized the Meridian was going down. The creature's tentacles had crushed something vital below the waterline, and freezing Gulf water poured through breaches faster than the pumps could handle. Nancy stood at the rail with the sphere's container strapped to her chest, bathed in blue light that seemed to call to the massive shapes moving beneath our listing vessel. The artifact pulsed in patterns that matched the bioluminescent signals from the depths, creating a conversation I couldn't understand, but felt in my bones. Barbara stumbled toward the emergency equipment locker, blood from her head wound making her movements unsteady. "Donald, the life rafts. We need to deploy them now." I yanked the emergency release handle, but the mechanisms had been damaged by the hull compression. The rafts remained locked in their housing while the ship continued its fatal roll toward the water. Through the gaps in the deck plating, I could see Wayne's motionless form in the main cabin. Guy's burned body lay beside him, both men beyond any help I could provide. The rising water would reach them within minutes. "Barbara, grab whatever flotation you can find. We're abandoning ship." The emergency locator beacon sat in its mounting bracket near the communications station. I ripped it free and activated the automatic distress signal, knowing Coast Guard response would take hours we didn't have. Nancy remained at the rail, apparently mesmerized by her connection to the creature that was destroying our ship. The sphere's influence had overridden her survival instincts, leaving her standing in place while the deck rotated beneath her feet. A spare oxygen tank from the diving equipment offered the only chance of extended survival in water this cold. I strapped it across my shoulders and grabbed Barbara's arm. We jumped together on my count. "Stay close to me once we're in the water." The deck reached 60 degrees as the Meridian's death roll accelerated. Through the tilting portholes, I glimpsed the creature responsible for our destruction as it surfaced beside the sinking vessel. The thing defied every category of marine biology I knew. Tentacles thicker than tree trunks emerged from a central mass covered in scales the size of serving platters. Eyes, hundreds of them, dotted the creature's surface like black jewels, each one tracking different aspects of the destruction it had caused. Serrated appendages waved through the air with predatory intelligence, testing the consistency of everything they touched. Nancy's scream cut through the night air as one of the tentacles wrapped around her waist. The sphere's container remained strapped to her chest as the appendage lifted her from the deck, her legs kicking uselessly against the creature's grip. "The sphere chose me," she shouted, her voice carrying across the water with unnatural clarity. I understand its purpose now. The tentacle dragged her toward the creature's central mass, where rows of teeth arranged in spiraling patterns suggested a mouth designed for prey much larger than humans. Nancy's struggles weakened as the artifact's blue light intensified, her resistance fading as the sphere's influence overcame her fear. Her screams stopped abruptly as the tentacle pulled her beneath the surface. The sphere's pulsing continued underwater, visible through the black water like a beacon, guiding whatever other horrors waited in the depths. "Barbara, now!" We jumped from the collapsing deck into water so cold it felt like hitting concrete. The shock drove air from my lungs while the Gulf's November temperature immediately began stealing body heat through my soaked clothing. Barbara surfaced nearby, gasping from the cold and struggling to stay afloat with her head injury affecting her coordination. A section of deck plating floated past, and I helped her grab hold of the makeshift flotation device. "Hold on to this. Don't let go no matter what happens." The Meridian's final roll brought the superstructure crashing into the water with a sound like breaking bones. Wayne's body disappeared with the sinking vessel, dragged down by tons of flooding metal and machinery. The emergency beacon's signal light blinked steadily from where I held it above the waves, transmitting our coordinates to rescue services that might arrive in time to recover bodies. The creature's bioluminescent patterns continued beneath us, creating an underwater aurora that pulsed in rhythm with the stolen sphere. Barbara's grip on the debris weakened as hypothermia began shutting down her motor functions. Her breathing became shallow and irregular, while her skin took on the waxy appearance that meant her core temperature was dropping to critical levels. "Stay awake, Barbara. Keep talking to me." "Can't feel my hands," she whispered. "Everything's going numb." The sphere's light grew fainter as the creature carried Nancy toward deeper water, but the pulsing patterns never stopped. Whatever communication was taking place between the artifact and its creators, the conversation was continuing even as we floated above their ancient domain. Barbara's eyes closed despite my attempts to keep her conscious. Her breathing slowed to barely perceptible intervals before stopping entirely. Hypothermia claimed her while I held her lifeless form against the floating debris, unable to provide any warmth that might have made a difference. The beacon continued its automated distress call while I floated alone in the frigid Gulf waters, watching the creature's lights fade into abyssal darkness. Hours passed before I heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the direction of shore. Coast Guard rescue swimmers pulled me from the water with hands that felt impossibly warm compared to the ocean that had tried to kill me. Emergency blankets and heated oxygen helped stabilize my core temperature while the helicopter carried me toward Houston medical facilities. The hospital room smelled of disinfectant and industrial heating when I woke up 18 hours later. Severe hypothermia had nearly shut down my kidneys and liver, while psychological trauma manifested as gaps in my memory that doctors attributed to oxygen deprivation. Government officials appeared within hours of my awakening. Navy personnel wearing civilian clothes asked detailed questions about our mission while recording every response with equipment more sophisticated than standard interview procedures. They explained that the Deepwater Perseus had been destroyed by an underwater methane explosion that also sank our research vessel. Natural gas deposits beneath the seafloor had created a catastrophic blowout that left no survivors except me. The official report would list equipment failure as the cause of both disasters. The men showed me satellite images of a debris field where the Perseus had operated, along with sonar readings that showed no unusual geological formations on the ocean floor. Any evidence of structures or artifacts had been removed or reclassified at levels beyond my security clearance. "Your team died in a maritime industrial accident," the lead official explained while preparing legal documents. Natural gas explosions are unfortunate, but documented hazards in deep water drilling operations. The non-disclosure agreements covered every aspect of our mission, from the missing crew members to the equipment specifications to any unusual discoveries made during our investigation. Violation of the secrecy terms would result in federal prosecution under maritime security statutes. They also provided generous compensation for my trauma and loss of income, along with medical coverage for the psychological treatment they insisted I would need. The money felt like payment for my silence, rather than acknowledgement of my sacrifice. 3 weeks later, my apartment's mail slot contained a package with no return address. Inside, a single photograph showed the blue sphere sitting on a white laboratory table, surrounded by analysis equipment I didn't recognize. A handwritten note was attached with tape. It came from the abyss. I recognized the handwriting immediately, though it wasn't Nancy's. Someone from her organization had survived to complete the mission, and they wanted me to know the sphere had reached its intended destination. My team's deaths had been acceptable losses in an operation designed to succeed regardless of casualties. I sat staring at the photograph for nearly an hour, processing the implications of what it meant. The mission had never been about rescue or investigation. It had been about retrieval, and they had succeeded exactly as planned. My phone rang, the sound cutting through my thoughts like a blade. The display showed an unknown number with an area code I didn't recognize.